Hey folks, in this video I would like to lay out my approach and suggestions for learning a new opening. This is a topic that I think is really important to most players, and it's also something where I think a lot of players often get it wrong or at least are confused by the process. So I want to give you guys some kind of blueprint or framework for learning any opening you'd like and discuss a little bit about what it takes to truly master an opening. So I'm going to be breaking down this video into 3 parts and offer different suggestions for different rating levels. So we're going to talk about players between 0 to 1200 and how they should approach the opening, players 1200 to 1800 and how they should approach the opening, and of course we'll talk about what players 1800 and up should do as well to really try and master their openings. Now, of course, these are pretty arbitrary rating ranges, but just to make it clear, I'm basing them on your average online player at the 1200 level, 1800 level, and so on. Another way you can look at it is beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And ultimately, I do believe that players of different levels should approach studying the opening in different ways. So with that, let's get into it. So let's start with players between 0 and 1200. And so here, of course, I'm including people who have just learned the game, as well as people who have been playing for a little while, but still feel like they're in that beginner novice range and aren't really sure what they're doing. In general, if you're in this range, I think the amount of time you should be spending on the opening is very little, basically close to 0. What I would suggest for you guys instead is to focus on studying the game of chess as a whole, playing lots of games, and then reviewing them to learn from your mistakes. Some books that I really like for this level include a couple of books by Irving Chernev, including Logical Chess Move by Move and The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played. These are books that contain well-annotated games where the author explains move by move the strategy and the decision making that both players go through and why they made the moves that they did. These books that contain annotated games are some of the most instructive for players because they really introduce you to a lot of new ideas in chess. When it comes to the opening, I don't think most players, and this includes players well beyond 1200, should be trying to memorize a lot of variations and keep repeating moves over and over again. I don't think you're going to get really far with this approach. The problem with trying to memorize a bunch of moves in the opening is actually manifold. Number one, your opponents are probably not going to be playing the moves that you're looking at. Your opponents are probably going to be playing somewhat randomly in the opening. And so you're never going to get exactly what you studied before. And even if you do memorize a couple moves and you manage to get your opening on the board, if you don't really have a clear idea of what you're doing out of the opening or in the middle game, you're still going to struggle quite a bit. So what should players at this range focus on when it comes to the opening? Well, instead of trying to memorize moves and trying to memorize variations and the names of all these different openings, that stuff will kind of come over time. Instead, what I'd recommend is focusing on learning opening principles and trying to follow good opening principles and opening fundamentals in your games. If that phrase, opening principles, doesn't mean anything to you, I would strongly recommend inputting it into the YouTube search and finding some videos that describe these opening principles in detail. Things like developing your pieces, controlling the center, not bringing your queen out too early, not moving the same piece in the opening more than once, not making too many pawn moves, not weakening your king, getting your king castled. These are principles that are simple to understand at first, but honestly difficult to execute in your games. And if you review your games carefully, you'll see that both you and your opponent are probably breaking opening principles pretty frequently. So again, instead of trying to memorize moves or any kind of tricky lines, what I recommend is trying to develop an understanding of what good opening play looks like. There are lots of good openings out there. You can start with e4, d4, knight f3. With black, you have multiple options of what to do against whatever white does. The point is not choosing the perfect opening. The point is to learn how to approach the opening and play sensible moves regardless of the opening that shows up at the board. If you really want to learn some specific details about the opening, let's say the Ruy Lopez after knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5, or the Sicilian defense, then I'd recommend watching one of these 10-minute YouTube videos where they break down just the absolute basics of the opening and get you started. And from there, I'd say just play a lot of games, and after each game, try to review the opening and see where you might have made any mistakes. Again, the point is not to just memorize a bunch of moves and just remember what to do against everything. Chess is an infinitely deep game. There's no way you're going to be able to remember anything. The point is to develop your understanding so that no matter what your opponent throws at you, whatever random moves they make in the opening, you still feel like you can get a good game and you can get a good position. And if you follow opening principles, if you make sure you're developing your pieces and controlling the center and making sure none of your pieces are vulnerable to attack or getting lost and taking advantage of when your opponent hangs a piece, then I guarantee you, you will have lots of success in the opening without ever needing to memorize anything. The one case where I would suggest maybe in going and looking up a specific line is if your opponent catches you in some opening trap and you lose the game quickly. No one really likes getting caught in traps. It's always frustrating when you just lose out of the opening, and there's nothing more frustrating than just losing to the same trap over and over again. So if you feel like your opponent catches you in some trap and afterwards you want to look up how to beat it or how to at least not fall into the trap, I fully support that. But honestly, that case is going to be kind of rare. And again, if you're following typical opening principles, it'll be pretty rare that you're actually even going to be getting caught in these traps in the first place. But yeah, if you're losing to something like the Stafford Gambit, for example, as many of my students do, losing over and over again from this position, and you want to look up how to beat this very popular opening, I think that would be a good idea. But spending hours and hours trying to memorize lines and repeating them back and forth, that's not going to be giving you a lot of benefit in the long run. On that note, I quickly want to talk about whether it's actually worth it to play gambits yourself. So here's the thing. Not all gambits are created equal. Some gambits, for instance the England gambit after d4, e5, are more or less just based on tricks. And I wouldn't call this a real opening where you're actually getting some kind of cohesive setup. So what does it mean playing for tricks? It means you're hoping for your opponent to make some mistake so that you can just win the game out of the opening. You win their piece, you checkmate their king, and then game over. But the issue is if they don't fall into the trap, a lot of times you just get a bad position out of the opening, and I know many players that simply just resign the game when their opponents don't fall for their one trick. So ultimately, as you can imagine, this is not going to lead to great growth for your chess in the long run. If you just want to have some fun and catch your opponents in some traps, by all means, go for it. But if you're interested in actually developing your game and building up some kind of fundamental understanding, I would highly suggest playing real openings that real players play consistently and not playing for these tricks out of the opening. Sure, it can be fun to win a couple games quickly without ever making a move of your own, but eventually you'll get tired of it, and even if you do get to a higher level just using trick lines, eventually you're just going to be facing opponents that know what to do against your trap opening, they won't fall into any of the traps, and eventually you'll realize like you're just going to have to learn a new opening at that point, but you'll be effectively starting from scratch all over again. Whereas you could have been playing real openings this whole time, building up experience, and once you get to that higher level anyway, you'll already have a little bit of experience behind you and you won't feel like you're just completely behind the rest of the players at that rating range. Now, like I mentioned, not all gambits are created equal. There are lots of gambits that I would definitely consider real openings, where you're not just playing for one or two tricks out of the opening, you're playing to develop your pieces actively, and you're sacrificing a pawn for long-term compensation, long-term active play, meaning you're not just playing hope chess, where you're just hoping your opponent makes some wrong moves so you catch them. Instead, you're putting pressure on your opponent for many moves deep into the middle game and hoping to eventually capitalize on your dynamic and your attacking pressure. So a couple of good examples of what I would say is a real gambit are, for one, the Evans gambit. Let's say e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and now white plays this move b4. This is a move where white sacrifices a pawn in the opening, not because they want to just get their opponent in some quick traps, but because they actually want to build a powerful center with c3 and d4 and get a very quick initiative from the opening that extends deep into the middle game. This is an opening that even very strong grandmasters have played many times over because they actually believe in white's attacking chances, and even if the opponent plays well in response, white still gets decent attacking chances. So that's kind of what we're looking for from gambits. Another good example is the Benko gambit, which black plays against 1d4. Here, after knight f6, c4, c5, if white advances the pawn with d5, black has this interesting gambit idea with b5. Now the point of this one is that if white takes this pawn, black will then offer a second pawn. And if white doesn't simply want to lose their pawn back and they accept this one as well, then black will play bishop takes a6 here, and now black has sacrificed one pawn. But in the long run, what black is playing for is to put massive pressure on white's queenside. And this is done by developing the bishop to g7 and exerting pressure on this diagonal, and eventually, after castling, bringing this h-rook over to the b file. As you can see, black now has two open files for the rook on the queen side, and these provide long-term attacking chances. So this is not just black playing for tricks out of the opening, this is black playing for long-term initiative and really making it difficult for white to get a comfortable game. So like I mentioned, some gambits are better than others. If you're curious on what the dojo thinks about all of the most popular gambits out there, we actually did a full hour-long video where we ranked each gambit based on how playable we think it is, or whether we think it's essentially just playing for tricks. So I'll link to that in the description below if you're curious on what we think about all the different gambits out there. So to sum up, for the 0 to 1200 rating range, I think you should spend very little time actually trying to memorize moves or learning the names of the different variations. Instead, I think your focus should be on playing lots of games. Of course, longer time controls, in my opinion, are better for improvement than playing blitz and bullets. Reviewing your games in the opening as well as the middle game to see where you or your opponent could have done better, and then studying general books that teach you more about the general strategy of the game. Like I mentioned, 2 books by Irving Chernov are really good. Another one that I'm a big fan of is the Soviet Chess Primer, which breaks down a lot of the fundamental strategies for both the opening, middle game, and end game. And of course, a really popular choice among beginners is a great book by the world champion Jose Capablanca called Chess Fundamentals that I really strongly recommend.